The plaza outside the city courthouse shimmered in heat, a sheet of light bouncing off pale stone. Summer pressed down with the weight of a judgment, heavy and merciless. A voice cut through the noise of traffic, sharp and cruel enough to turn heads. "Hey, Professor, wrong door. The classroom's down the street." Detective Alan Mercer stood near his patrol car, words sharpened for ridicule. He jabbed a finger toward the avenue, his grin wide, his stance almost theatrical. Laughter broke out behind him, young officers slapping the hood, bending at the waist as if the insult were the cleverest thing they had heard all week. The man in the gray suit stopped mid-step on the marble stairway. He neither winced nor looked away. His posture remained upright, controlled, the slight tilt of his chin suggesting a dignity that mockery could bruise but not erase. Dr. Elias Marlowe, consultant in ethics and historian of forgotten struggles, had faced uglier storms in silence. He had built a life around restraint, convinced that battles won through patience lasted longer than victories claimed in anger. Yet silence weighed differently when it was demanded by scorn. Every laugh carved something unseen. Every camera raised in the crowd captured not just a moment, but a warning. Injustice made visible. The plaza breathed uneasily. A group of pedestrians froze at the sound, half ashamed to watch, half unwilling to turn away. Phones hovered higher. The laughter wavered, though Mercer's smirk held. Beside him, Officer Kyle Danner lowered his gaze, fussing with the dial of his radio. His youth betrayed him. He had joined the force to make a difference, but years of silence had already bent his back. He shifted from foot to foot, color high in his cheeks, caught between loyalty and the faint thrum of shame. Elias inhaled through his nose, tasting the city's heat and dust. That morning had begun with black coffee and scattered files. The oak table in his apartment carried stacks of testimony, reports of misconduct, patterns woven through decades of neglect. He had been asked to present them to the commission, to map the distance between law and justice. His daughters had sent him cautious texts. "Be careful, Dad. People don't like hearing the truth." He had smiled at their worry. He had buttoned his jacket, tightened his tie, and driven into the city with the quiet hope that reason might still change hearts. He had not expected his first test of the day to arrive on the courthouse steps. The insult clung to the air like smoke. Mercer's laughter came again, thinner now, cracked by the weight of watching eyes. His words had drawn blood, but the crowd refused to disperse. They sensed something larger hovering in the heat. A voice broke the tension. "That's enough." Clear, steady, female. It carried no anger, only the blunt courage of someone who refused to look away. The laughter faltered. Heads turned. Elias shifted slightly, just enough to find her. She stood near the fountain, denim jacket loose at her shoulders. Phone raised, but gaze locked on him. Recognition lit her eyes. Not pity, not curiosity. Recognition, as though she saw beneath the surface, as though she knew the man they were trying to reduce was something far larger than their laughter. The moment was fleeting, but sharp. Elias parted his lips, the outline of words forming, but he stopped himself. Silence held its own power, especially when paired with a look that neither flinched nor broke. He let the insult dissolve into the heat. He turned, climbing the stairs with measured steps, each one a refusal. Inside, the courthouse air was cooler, but the burn remained on his skin. Marble corridors stretched ahead, echoing with the hush of legal machinery in motion. Clerks passed with arms full of papers, interns balancing laptops, guards nodding at familiar faces. For them, he was another suited figure among many. For him, the air carried the aftertaste of humiliation and the fragile root of something else. Behind the doors, the crowd still stirred. The woman's gaze lingered, even through glass, tethering him to the plaza he had left. He knew instinctively that this was not the end of it. Something small had shifted, subtle but irreversible. Mercer's laughter would fade by evening. Danner's silence would haunt him longer. The cameras would multiply online, each frame preserving the insult, the crowd, the refusal to bend. And Elias Marlowe, dignified in restraint, carried with him the understanding that the cost of silence was no longer his alone to bear. The courthouse doors closed with a whisper. His polished shoes echoed against marble floors. The files in his briefcase grew heavier with each step, not from paper, but from expectation. In the chamber ahead waited arguments, testimony, and a commission already resistant to change. Outside, the heat pressed harder, the voices grew louder, and the city itself braced for collision. At the top of the stairs, Elias paused. He smoothed his tie, drew a slow breath, and walked toward the chamber where his work would begin. Yet even as he moved forward, he felt it again. That thread from the plaza, the recognition in a stranger's eyes. It followed him like a whisper, a promise that silence would not last forever. The insult still hung behind him, smoke in the air. But beneath it, something new had been born. The hearing chamber felt colder than the marble corridor, though the air conditioning rattled weakly in the corners. Rows of chairs lined the gallery, filled with reporters, citizens, and officials in suits whose eyes carried the weight of skepticism. Elias Marlowe set his briefcase on the table, fingers brushing the worn leather as if steadying himself against more than wood. He could feel the plaza still clinging to him, the laughter echoing faintly, the look of the woman near the fountain refusing to leave his mind. Commissioner Richard Halloway, silver hair sculpted into authority, cleared his throat at the head of the long mahogany table. Dr. Marlowe, thank you for joining us. I trust your morning was uneventful? His voice carried the dryness of someone who already doubted the necessity of this meeting. Elias met his eyes without hesitation. It was instructive, he said quietly. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. A few commissioners shifted in their seats. He opened the first file, spreading photographs across the polished surface. Grainy images of bruised wrists, damaged vehicles, testimony written in hurried script. His voice remained steady as he traced the patterns aloud. Stops made without cause, names repeated across complaint forms, outcomes buried in administrative dust. He spoke without theatrics, each word measured, as though he were building a wall brick by brick. The room listened, though not all with the same ear. Some commissioners leaned forward, compelled. Others leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for a flaw to expose. Outside the glass doors, shadows moved. Officers assigned to monitor the session, their presence a reminder of who still held the streets. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Camera shutters clicked. The truth was not dramatic, Elias thought. It was cumulative. It was in the repetition of injury, the persistence of silence. He felt his throat tighten once but pressed on, reminding himself that restraint did not mean retreat. Halfway through his presentation, the doors opened with a soft groan. Detective Mercer stepped inside, swaggering as if summoned. Danner trailed behind, his face pale, his uniform hanging loose on tense shoulders. A murmur rose among the gallery. Mercer ignored it. He slid into the back row, legs spread wide, smirk fixed like armor. Elias did not falter, though the air thickened. He continued outlining the data, citing percentages, quoting testimony. Still, his gaze brushed the back row, catching Mercer's smirk, catching Danner's downward stare. For a moment memory surged, heat on marble steps, laughter bouncing off stone. He steadied himself against it. Commissioner Halloway leaned forward. Dr. Marlowe, you're presenting strong claims, but do you have evidence tying these patterns to individuals rather than systems? Names, not numbers? Elias paused. He thought of Mercer's voice outside, the insult spat into sunlight. He thought of the files in his briefcase, the pages that bore the detective's name like a stain. Slowly, he opened another folder, laying it flat. Yes, he said. Names are here. Patterns, too. The photographs shifted. One captured a young man pressed against a patrol car, his wrists cuffed too tightly, eyes squeezed shut in pain. Another showed a teacher in handcuffs outside her school, students watching through windows. Each report carried signatures of officers, Mercer's appearing again and again. The gallery shifted, voices stirring. Mercer's smirk wavered, just slightly. Danner's jaw clenched, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. Elias spoke carefully, each word chosen like a blade. When misconduct repeats itself under the same name, it ceases to be error. It becomes practice, and practice, unchecked, becomes culture. For a moment the chamber stilled. Even the air seemed to pause. Then Mercer laughed softly, a sharp bark meant to reclaim control. Culture? You academics love your words. Out on the street, things look different. We deal with reality, not theories. Commissioner Holloway frowned, but Mercer did not stop. His voice rose, aimed at the gallery more than the table. Men like me keep this city from burning. And you want to crucify us with paperwork? Danner closed his eyes, as though each word struck him personally. Elias allowed the silence to stretch before answering. If order depends on humiliation, then the city is already burning. The words hung heavy, undeniable. Even Mercer seemed caught off guard, his smirk cracking for the first time. The pivot shifted the room. Reporters scribbled faster. Citizens leaned forward, caught in the weight of conflict. Holloway tapped his pen, unease flickering in his eyes. Before anyone could speak, a sound rose outside, chanting. The muffled roar of voices swelled through the courthouse walls, protesters gathering strength. The windows vibrated faintly with the rhythm of the crowd. Signs bobbed in the heat, slogans echoing demands for change. The city itself was pressing in. The commissioners exchanged glances. Mercer muttered under his breath, his shoulders stiffening. Danner looked at the floor, his silence heavier than before. Elias closed the final file, letting his hands rest on the table. This is not theory. It is lived reality, documented and ignored until now. The question is whether this commission has the courage to face it. No one answered immediately. The chant outside grew louder, words breaking through the glass. Justice now. Justice now. The rhythm was steady, insistent, impossible to ignore. Elias looked toward the gallery. His gaze swept across reporters, citizens, uniformed men, and finally the back row. Danner's eyes lifted for a second, catching Elias's. There was a flicker there. Guilt, fear, maybe recognition. Then the young officer looked away. Mercer leaned back, jaw tight, smirk gone. He muttered something Elias could not hear. The chamber waited, suspended. The protest outside thundered louder. The weight of silence pressed like a storm waiting to break. Elias gathered his papers slowly, deliberately. His movements spoke what his voice withheld. This was only the beginning. The chanting outside had become a drumbeat by the time Elias left the chamber. The marble corridors trembled faintly with every syllable the crowd pushed against the courthouse walls. His steps echoed in counterpoint, deliberate and even, though his chest carried the aftershock of Mercer's interruption and the commission's unease. He held his briefcase tighter, as if its leather sides contained not papers, but resolve. Through the glass doors at the plaza, the crowd surged. Signs painted in hurried brushstrokes swayed above the heads of citizens pressed shoulder to shoulder. Some faces were young and fierce, others older, weathered by years of waiting for promises never kept. Their voices fused into a rhythm older than any commission. Justice now. Justice now. Elias paused in the doorway. Heat struck him again, layered with the smell of exhaust, sweat, and faint hints of street food drifting from vendors who had abandoned their carts to join the crowd. The sound vibrated through his ribs. This was more than protest, it was collective refusal. At the edge of the plaza, Mercer stood with arms crossed, jaw clenched, flanked by two uniformed officers who looked less certain than he did. His smirk was gone, replaced by something harder, thinner. A man whose performance had been disrupted, whose authority was now measured against a crowd he could not control. Danner stood a few steps back, hands clasped too tightly behind his back, his gaze darting between the protesters and his partner. His face betrayed a conflict he could not disguise. When his eyes brushed Elias's across the space, they faltered, then dropped quickly. The crowd spotted Elias at the doorway, their chants pausing for a breath, reshaping into something directed. "Stand with us! Stand with us!" The words rose like a tide, their rhythm swelling until the air itself seemed to demand a response. Elias did not raise his hand, did not gesture, but he stepped down the marble stairs into the heat. The crowd parted slightly, enough to let him move forward, their eyes fixed on him not as a savior, but as a witness they recognized. He felt the weight of expectation settle heavier than his briefcase. A young woman pushed through the throng, denim jacket loose around her shoulders, her phone still raised. She was closer now, her eyes steady, the same recognition burning as before. For the first time, Elias saw more than defiance there. He saw fatigue, the exhaustion of someone who had shouted into silence for too long. Yet when she looked at him, her expression steadied. Not pity, alignment. Mercer barked an order. "Clear the steps. This is police business." His voice cracked slightly at the edges, but his authority still carried. The two officers beside him moved half a step forward, though their hesitation was plain. The crowd answered with louder chants. Elias remained still. He understood the danger in escalation, the ease with which force could replace reason. He had studied enough histories to know how quickly moments tipped. His silence was deliberate, his posture calm, but his eyes fixed on Mercer, steady as stone. The detective's hand twitched near his belt. A dangerous gesture, one the crowd noticed instantly. Phones lifted higher, voices sharpened into anger. Danner stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. "Allen, don't." Mercer shot him a glare, but the younger officer did not move back. His hand hovered near Mercer's arm, not touching, but close enough to signal fracture. The crowd felt it too, a split in the wall of uniforms, small but visible. The chant faltered, replaced by murmurs, phones recording every twitch, every silence. Elias inhaled, his breath deliberate. He thought of his daughters, their text messages flashing across memory, their worry for his safety. He thought of the files still heavy in his case, of the commission's faces struggling to choose between denial and truth. He thought of how humiliation on the steps had already multiplied into this, the city watching, waiting for someone to hold steady. He lowered his voice, speaking not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but directly to Mercer. "Every gesture is being watched. Choose carefully." The words carried no threat, only fact, but they landed like a stone on glass. Mercer's eyes narrowed, his mouth a thin line. The crowd sensed his hesitation, their murmurs rising. From the corner of his vision, Elias caught the woman in the denim jacket again. Her phone was steady, but her free hand trembled slightly, curled into a fist she pressed against her thigh. She was recording more than a standoff. She was recording a threshold. The pivot came quietly. Danner stepped closer to Mercer, his voice firmer now. "Enough. Let it go." His words weren't loud, but in the sudden hush they carried across the plaza. The crowd stilled, listening. Mercer stiffened, rage flaring in his eyes, but Danner didn't flinch. For the first time, the younger officer chose to be seen. The silence stretched long, broken only by the restless shouts from the far edge of the protest. A siren wailed faintly several blocks away, weaving through traffic toward the courthouse. Elias felt the weight of the moment press into his skin. Something fragile balanced on the edge, restraint or collapse, dignity or violence. Mercer's jaw clenched hard enough to strain the tendons in his neck. His hand fell from his belt. He spat onto the pavement, muttered a curse, and turned on his heel, pushing past Danner. The two officers behind him followed, uncertain, their authority unraveling under the gaze of dozens of cameras. The crowd erupted, half in triumph, half in disbelief. Chants shifted into cheers, voices colliding into a storm of sound that rolled over the plaza. Signs waved higher, fists punched the air. The marble steps trembled with the force of celebration, though the tension had not vanished, only shifted. Elias stood still amid the roar, his silence again becoming armor. He looked once more at the woman with the camera. She lowered it at last, her eyes meeting his across the distance. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition deepening into something closer to promise. The siren grew louder, closer, the rising wail cutting through cheers. Police reinforcements were arriving. The crowd did not disperse. The city held its breath, waiting to see what would follow. Elias adjusted his grip on the briefcase, his shoulders squared. He knew the day was far from over. The marble beneath him felt less like foundation now, more like a fault line waiting to split. The siren's echo reached the plaza, red and blue lights flaring against stone. The crowd's chant shifted once more, urgent, pressing. "Stand with us! Stand with us!" Elias did not move, caught in the collision of voices, lights, and expectation. His silence held, but the seed of change had already broken soil. The siren split the air as the patrol cars swung into the plaza. Red and blue strobed across pale marble, painting every face in alternating light, every eye caught in the pulse of authority. The crowd's chant faltered, then rose louder, defiant, swelling to meet the noise of engines and brakes. Doors slammed in unison. Reinforcements stepped out, their boots striking the ground with the weight of training, hands resting close to holsters, though none yet drawn. The officers formed a loose line at the base of the courthouse steps, their presence meant to project order, yet their faces betrayed unease. They had walked into a scene already alive with tension, cameras raised like shields, voices rising with heat. Elias Marlowe stood at the midpoint of the steps, his briefcase steady at his side, his eyes calm though his pulse thundered. He felt the protesters behind him, their voices urging him forward. He felt the officers below, their authority pressing upward. He was the hinge between two forces, each demanding recognition. Alan Mercer reappeared from the crowd, his expression hard, his shoulders squared with renewed purpose. He strode toward the reinforcements as if claiming command, his voice pitched to carry. "Contain the crowd! Push them back! This is out of control!" But his words collided with the sound of chanting and the whir of cameras. The officers hesitated, their gazes shifting toward the protesters, then toward Elias, then back to Mercer. Uncertainty rippled through the line, visible cracks in the wall he tried to build. Kyle Danner moved slowly, positioning himself near Mercer, though his body leaned away, not toward. His eyes flicked to Elias. A quick glance filled with something Elias could not yet name, warning, perhaps, or apology. Danner's lips pressed tight, the words trapped in his throat visible only in the taut line of his jaw. The young woman in the denim jacket edged closer through the crowd, her camera still raised but her focus shifting. She was no longer simply recording. She was framing, shaping the moment into evidence that could outlast the plaza. Her presence was steady, her gaze unwavering, though Elias saw the strain in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped her phone as if it were both weapon and lifeline. The chanting rose again, louder, spilling into the plaza in waves. "Stand with us! Stand with us!" The voices fused into one body, one will, vibrating through the stone. Elias felt it press against him, demanding not silence but acknowledgement. Mercer barked again, louder now, anger breaking through his composure. "Move them back, now! Use force if you have to!" His hand slashed through the air, a gesture sharpened into command. The pivot came with stillness. None of the reinforcements moved. Their boots stayed planted, their hands near belts but not drawn, their eyes darting toward one another in silent calculation. The weight of the crowd, the cameras, the sheer presence of witnesses pinned them in place. One officer shifted uneasily and muttered, "Too many cameras." Another whispered something about protocol, but the words dissolved under the chants. Mercer's face darkened, the flush of fury climbing his neck. He turned to Danner, his voice low but audible enough for those near the steps. "Get them moving. Don't just stand there." Danner's eyes flicked to Elias again, then to the woman with the camera, then back to Mercer. His voice was quiet, but in the hushed space between chants it carried. "We escalate here. We lose everything." The words cracked the silence, audible to those who needed to hear them. Mercer's glare could have burned stone, but Danner did not look away this time. His stance shifted, no longer shadow but resistance. Elias felt the shift ripple through the crowd. Their chants softened, replaced with murmurs of anticipation, their energy turning toward this young officer who had broken the wall of silence. The moment balanced precariously, fragile as glass. Mercer snapped. His hand jerked toward his weapon, not drawing it fully but touching the grip with enough force to ignite panic. A collective gasp swept the crowd. Phones zoomed, recording every millisecond. The air bristled with the possibility of disaster. Elias stepped forward, one measured stride down the marble, his voice firm, carrying without shouting. "Detective Mercer." He spoke the name like a gavel strike, sharp and final. The sound of it froze the moment. Mercer's eyes cut toward him, wild with fury, but his hand stilled. "You are surrounded not by enemies," Elias continued, "but by witnesses. Every move you make is judgment upon yourself." The words did not echo. They absorbed into the charged silence, heavy and undeniable. The crowd held its breath. The reinforcements shifted again, their shoulders loosening, their hands falling away from weapons. The fragile edge receded, just slightly, enough for air to return to lungs. Mercer's teeth ground audibly, his smirk twisting back into something brittle, desperate. "You think words save you, Professor? This city eats men like you alive." Elias did not answer. His silence was not retreat now. It was defiance, sharper than any reply. The chant began again, softer this time, almost reverent. "Stand with us." The siren from the last car finally cut out, leaving the plaza exposed to its own sound. The absence of the wail made everything louder. The chants, the scrape of boots, even the flutter of flags in the hot wind. The city itself seemed to be listening. The woman in the denim jacket lowered her phone just enough to let her hand fall to her side. Her gaze remained locked on Elias. In her eyes, he saw not only recognition, but expectation, an unspoken demand that silence could no longer serve. Commissioner Holloway appeared at the courthouse doorway, flanked by aides. His face was pale, drawn tight, the strain of political calculation pulling every feature taut. He scanned the plaza, the crowd, the officers, then Elias. For a moment his lips parted, ready to speak. Then he closed them again. Whatever words he had were not ready for this air. The crowd surged louder, their chants shifting with force. "We see you. We see you." The phrase echoed like thunder, drowning out even Mercer's muttered curses. Danner stood frozen between his partner and the plaza, his choice already made but not yet spoken. Elias's hand tightened on the briefcase, his mind cataloging every detail. Mercer's trembling fury, Danner's fractured silence, the cameras, the chants, the commissioner's hesitation. History was not waiting. It was unfolding. The red and blue lights pulsed against marble, reflecting in glass and sweat. Elias lifted his gaze to the courthouse doors still half open, the shadow of the chamber behind them, and then back to the sea of faces before him. He did not move. He did not speak. The moment held, suspended, high stakes strung taut between silence and eruption. The plaza did not quiet. It rippled with sound, 1,000 voices shifting rhythm but never breaking. Elias Marlowe remained steady on the marble steps, one hand on his briefcase, his body poised between courthouse and crowd. He had not spoken since his last words cut through Mercer's fury, but silence was no longer invisibility. Silence had become center. Commissioner Holloway lingered in the doorway behind him, trapped between duty and fear. His aides whispered in urgent tones, their eyes darting to the cameras, the chanting, the line of officers holding uneasily at the base of the steps. Every angle screamed politics. Every hesitation threatened to expose cowardice. Elias did not look back. His focus fixed on the crowd, on the woman with the denim jacket now standing at the front, her phone lowered, her eyes unyielding. She was closer than she had ever been. Close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her hands, the pale tension around her mouth. She was young, but the weight of years pressed behind her stare. She was not alone. The faces around her mirrored the same demand. Stop watching. Start standing. Alan Mercer prowled like a caged dog, his movements sharp, shoulders rolling as though the air itself had insulted him. His authority had slipped once, and he fought to claw it back with every gesture. He barked at the reinforcements again, his voice cracking. "Push them back! Do your job!" But the officers shifted their weight, looked anywhere but at him. Their silence was louder than refusal. It drew a fresh wave of cheers from the crowd, their voices feeding on hesitation. "We see you. We see you." Kyle Danner stood just behind Mercer, the crease between his brows deepening with each chant. Sweat clung to his hairline, his jaw tight as though bracing against something more than the heat. He glanced at Elias, and for the first time his gaze held longer than a flicker. There was fear in it, yes, but also a plea, unspoken words that begged for acknowledgement. The pivot came with motion, sudden and raw. A bottle arced from the far edge of the crowd, spinning under the sunlight before shattering harmlessly against the pavement. The sound cracked the air, glass skittering across stone. A gasp surged through the plaza. Phones swung to capture it, chants wavered, and every hand twitched near a weapon. Mercer lunged on the sound, his instincts igniting like fire. His hand went to his belt, weapon half drawn, voice booming. "Enough! Disperse or be dispersed!" The crowd recoiled, a wave shifting backward then pressing forward again, caught between fear and fury. Officers tensed, but none moved first. Danner's hand clamped down on Mercer's arm, stopping the gun from clearing its holster. His voice, low but forceful, tore through the chaos. "Don't do it, Alan. You'll light the match." The two men locked eyes, sweat and rage burning between them. Mercer's fury was pure, stripped of performance. Danner's grip tightened, his knuckles white, his stance wide. For a heartbeat, the plaza stilled, every camera trained on the confrontation, every voice caught in suspension. Elias stepped forward another pace, his shoes scuffing marble. His voice did not rise, but it carried. What happens here will not be forgotten. Not by them, not by history. The words were not meant as threat. They were truth, laid bare, and the silence that followed confirmed it. Even Mercer felt it. His hand trembled, though his glare remained fixed. Danner's grip did not falter. The woman in denim lifted her phone again, steadier now. She was recording not a humiliation, not a performance, but a fracture. Elias saw her eyes, saw the moment she realized that what she captured was no longer just protest, it was proof. Commissioner Holloway descended 2 steps, his voice cracking with forced authority. "Detectives, stand down. Officers, hold your line. Nobody moves unless I say." His command shook, but it landed. The reinforcements froze, grateful for any excuse to remain still. Mercer's mouth twisted in rage, but his gun slid back into its holster under Danner's grip. The crowd roared in triumph, the sound swelling like a storm breaking against stone. Chants turned into cheers, though tension still pulsed beneath. Elias exhaled quietly, his shoulders loosening though his eyes stayed sharp. This was not victory. It was reprieve. Mercer ripped his arm free from Danner and stormed down the steps, shoving past the officers, his curses bleeding into the noise. Danner did not follow. He remained halfway up the steps, his chest rising hard, his gaze locked on Elias. Something had broken inside him, something he could no longer silence. The chant shifted again, voices pounding the air. With us. With us. The words no longer pleaded. They demanded. Elias stood caught between crowd and courthouse, silence heavy in his throat. He felt Holloway's eyes on his back, felt the commissioners waiting for retreat, felt the protest surging with expectation. The woman in denim had lowered her phone again. Now she simply looked at him, her eyes unblinking, the question clear. Would he step fully into the space they had opened? Or would silence cost him again? The crowd's roar swelled, pressing against his ribs, demanding an answer he had not yet given. Elias gripped the handle of his briefcase tighter, his body poised on the fault line between duty and demand. His lips parted, words gathering. Then he stopped. The sound of boots echoed from the street beyond the plaza, another wave of officers marching closer. The cheer faltered. Phones swung toward the avenue. The reinforcements had not ended. They had only begun. Elias remained still on the marble, his silence stretched thin, suspended in the roar of voices and the approaching rhythm of boots. The second wave arrived with the rhythm of boots slamming asphalt, their cadence echoing off glass towers. The sound rolled into the plaza like a drumbeat of inevitability. The chanting faltered as the line of uniforms appeared from the avenue, dozens strong, helmets gleaming, shields strapped tight to forearms, batons hung at their sides like blunt promises. The crowd swayed as though pushed by wind. Phones rose higher, capturing every detail, every shadow, every glint of steel. The sunlight refracted off visors, splintering across the marble steps where Elias Marlowe stood. His breath slowed against the rising clamor. He knew this rhythm. History repeated itself in sound before it repeated itself in blood. Alan Mercer re-emerged at the front of the advancing line, his earlier fury now carved into something colder. His eyes sought Elias immediately, locking on him as though the crowd had dissolved. His stride carried vindication, the certainty of a man backed by numbers. The grin returned, brittle and triumphant. Kyle Danner hesitated near the courthouse steps, his posture taut, his gaze fixed on the shields closing in. He had stopped Mercer once, but could he stop a column of silence marching under command? His lips moved with words he didn't voice, his throat tight as if swallowed by the weight of the moment. Commissioner Holloway retreated up a step, his face pale under the flashing light. His aides whispered frantic strategies, none of them strong enough to mask fear. He wanted order, but not responsibility. His authority cracked with every chant, every lens fixed on his indecision. The woman in denim jacket pushed to the front of the crowd, her phone steady despite the tremor in her hands. Her eyes burned with defiance, but Elias saw the raw edge beneath. Courage did not erase fear. It only refused to bow to it. She glanced briefly at him, and though her lips did not move, the message was clear. Do not abandon us. The new line of officers spread across the plaza, their formation practiced, their bodies trained to push. The chant weakened, replaced by murmurs, nervous laughter, quick breaths. A man near the front shouted something about rights, his voice breaking as a baton twitched against a shield. Tension seeped into every crevice of the marble square, heavy enough to choke. Mercer raised his arm. The gesture was simple, a conductor ready to cue violence. The pivot arrived not with his motion, but with sound. From somewhere in the crowd came music, thin, almost fragile, but unmistakable. A harmonica, trembling notes carried by air, weaving through the tension like a thread of memory. The plaza froze, caught between laughter and disbelief. The sound was haunting, echoing against stone and steel. The officers hesitated. The crowd, uncertain, shifted their chants into hums, voices folding into the melody until the plaza became a low, steady song. For the first time since arriving, the second wave faltered. Their boots no longer moved in unison. Their shields lowered slightly, confusion cutting into formation. Mercer's arm hung suspended. His jaw clenched as the music wound through the air, slipping past his command like water through fingers. He barked an order, but it was swallowed by the song. The crowd had found a new rhythm, one Mercer could not command. Elias stepped forward, his shoes striking marble with calm certainty. He moved down the steps, closer to the line of shields, closer to the fracture. The harmonica carried him, the crowd humming behind him like an anchor of sound. His silence was no longer retreat. It was part of the music, steady, unbroken. He stopped at the final step, face to face with the wall of glass visors. His voice emerged low, clear. Every decision here is already history. What will you choose to be remembered for? The shields did not advance. The officers behind them glanced at one another, their hesitation magnified under the press of cameras. Mercer snarled, grabbing the edge of a shield, shoving it forward himself. The officer holding it staggered, resisting the force of his own commander. Danner shouted then, loud enough for all to hear, "Hold your line! Do not advance!" His voice cracked but carried, echoing across the plaza. Every head turned toward him. The young officer's face was pale, drenched in sweat, but his eyes burned with something fierce, a fire long restrained. Mercer spun, fury erupting. "You don't give the orders!" His hand shot toward Danner's chest, shoving hard, but the officer did not stumble back. Danner planted his feet, meeting Mercer's glare with a defiance that shocked even himself. The crowd erupted into cheers, the hum of songs swelling into words again. "With us, with us." The chant shook the marble, thunder in human voices. Phones trembled in hands, recording the fracture of a wall that had always seemed solid. Holloway shouted something from the steps, but his words vanished under the roar. His face was pale, his hands trembling, authority leaking out of him with every second. He looked less like a commissioner now, and more like a spectator caught in history's flood. Elias felt the shift deep in his chest. This was not victory. It was fracture, a split wide enough for change but dangerous enough for collapse. His silence, his restraint, had carried him here, but silence alone would not hold the line. Mercer's hand twitched near his weapon again, rage overriding hesitation. The crowd gasped, but before he could draw, Danner's voice cut sharp. "Enough!" The word rang like a gunshot, his hand raised not in violence but in command. The second wave froze, caught between loyalty and conscience. The harmonica notes drifted to silence. The chant ebbed, leaving only breathing, rapid and uneven, human and raw. The plaza was suspended, the fault line visible, everyone waiting for one motion to decide everything. Elias's eyes locked on Danner's, the young officer trembling but standing, his silence finally broken. In that gaze was recognition, fragile but unmistakable, the acknowledgement that quiet compliance had a cost too heavy to carry. The red and blue lights spun faster, the sirens silent but their presence screaming. The air thickened with waiting. Elias opened his mouth, words hovering on the edge. But before he spoke, a voice rose from the crowd, not a chant, not a song, but a single cry. "Name him! Say his name!" Dozens echoed, then hundreds. The sound grew, thunderous. They weren't chanting slogans anymore, they were demanding truth. The name they wanted was Mercer's. Elias looked at the detective, his face contorted in rage, his hand hovering dangerously close to violence. then back at the crowd, voices burning through the air like fire. The demand was undeniable. The moment was a cliff, and Elias stood on its edge. The crowd's chant was no longer a rhythm. It was a demand. Name him. Say his name. The words rose like thunder, rolling against the courthouse, bouncing between the marble towers, gathering force with each echo. Phones caught everything. Every face, every hesitation, every crack in the moment. Elias Marlowe stood at the center, his hand gripping the leather of his briefcase so tightly the handle dug into his skin. His silence had carried him through humiliation and confrontation, had held him like armor, but silence now felt like a cliff edge. Each chant pushed him closer. Name him. Say his name. Alan Mercer stood just beyond the line of shields, his mouth twisted into a sneer that masked fear with rage. His hand hovered dangerously close to his weapon. He wanted Elias to stay silent. He needed it. For silence meant complicity, meant the story would dissolve into the same haze of rumors and denials that had buried countless others. Kyle Danner stood a pace behind Mercer, his chest heaving, his jaw set. He had spoken once already, loud enough for all to hear, but his voice trembled now, uncertain whether one shout was enough to fracture the wall. His eyes clung to Elias as though begging him to finish what he had started. Commissioner Holloway loomed at the courthouse entrance, his face carved into panic. Every whisper from his aides was drowned by the chant. He wanted retreat, negotiation, compromise, anything that might smother the fire without burning him. But the flames had already leapt too high. The woman in the denim jacket had lowered her phone. She no longer filmed. She stared only at Elias. Her eyes were clear, steady, brimming not with pity, but insistence. She had recorded enough to expose humiliation. Now she demanded more, words spoken out loud, not left to silence. Elias closed his eyes briefly. He felt the weight of history pressing on him. He had built a life around quiet observation, around the belief that truth revealed itself without needing to be shouted. But this was not a lecture hall or a commission chamber. This was a square full of witnesses, a city staring at him, a moment teetering on collapse. The pivot came when Mercer stepped forward, his boots striking the marble, his voice pitched to reclaim control. "This man incites violence," he shouted, pointing at Elias. "He stands with criminals, not citizens. Arrest him now!" The words split the air. The line of officers hesitated, their visors glinting, their hands twitching at their belts. The crowd erupted, boos and curses clashing with shouts of defiance. The chant stuttered, broken by anger. Phones surged higher. The balance wavered, fragile as glass. Elias opened his eyes. His voice emerged low, steady, but strong enough to carry. "His name is Alan Mercer." The plaza went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then the crowd roared, their voices fusing into a storm. "Mercer! Mercer!" The name thundered through the square, stripping the detective's armor of anonymity. Every camera captured his face, every voice stamped it into memory. Mercer's composure shattered. He lunged toward Elias, fury burning through restraint, his hand ripping the gun from its holster. Gasps split the air. The line of shields wavered, caught between loyalty and horror. But Danner moved faster. His arm shot out, shoving Mercer back with both hands, his voice cracking as it tore free. "Drop it! Now!" The detective stumbled, his weapon half raised but unsteady. For a heartbeat it pointed nowhere and everywhere, the crowd screaming, the officers frozen. Danner's hand pressed down hard, forcing Mercer's arm toward the ground. The gun clattered against marble, the sound sharp as a hammer blow. The plaza erupted in cheers, gasps, frantic shouts. The chant twisted into something new, fierce and jubilant. We saw it. We saw it. Mercer's face contorted with disbelief. His authority, his control, his shield of silence, gone. He staggered, shoving against Danner, spitting curses, his voice ragged. But the officers did not move to help him. They stared instead, their eyes darting between Elias, the crowd, and the man whose weapon lay gleaming on stone. Commissioner Holloway shouted from the steps, but his words were swallowed. His authority meant nothing now. The narrative had already shifted. Elias stood unmoving, his breath steady. He had not raised his hands, had not shouted. He had only spoken the truth aloud, and the truth had erupted like a fire no one could smother. He met Mercer's eyes, saw the rage curdle into desperation, saw the realization of defeat. Danner stooped quickly, scooping up the weapon, his hands trembling. He held it pointed down, away from both crowd and partner. His eyes darted to Elias again, searching, almost pleading. The crowd roared around them, but in that gaze Elias recognized something deeper, the beginning of a break, a man stepping away from silence into danger. The woman in the denim jacket pressed through the crowd until she stood at the foot of the steps. She lifted her chin, her gaze fierce. "We're not leaving," she called, her voice cutting through noise. "Not until it's written down. Not until it's recorded." Her words carried, fusing with the chants, shaping them into a demand that could not be ignored. Phones zoomed, capturing her face, her voice, her defiance. Elias looked at her, then at the crowd, then at the officers frozen between two futures. He felt the moment tighten, every breath suspended. Mercer lunged again, shouting incoherently, but Danner blocked him, holding him back with the strength of someone who finally understood the cost of inaction. The struggle was raw, visible, undeniable. Cameras devoured it. The chant grew louder, almost deafening. We saw it. We saw it. The crowd no longer demanded recognition. They proclaimed it. Elias tightened his grip on the briefcase, his chest heavy. This was not resolution. It was exposure. The reckoning had only begun. Above them, the courthouse loomed, its windows reflecting the chaos, its doors half open like a wound. The city waited inside, the commission cowering, the system resisting. Outside, the people roared. Elias stood between them, silence still his armor but no longer his shield. The cost of restraint had been paid. The demand for truth had been spoken. What came next would decide whether the city broke or transformed. Mercer thrashed in Danner's grip, his curses drowning in the chant, his career unraveling in real time. The woman in denim held her ground, her gaze fixed on Elias. The commissioner's pale face disappeared back into the courthouse shadows. The crowd surged forward a step, not violent, but unstoppable. Phones reached higher, voices thundered louder, history pressed harder. Elias drew a breath. The marble vibrating under his shoes, the air vibrating with demand. He did not move. The moment hung suspended, the cliff edge yawning wider. The roar of the crowd surged until the marble itself seemed to shake. Alan Mercer struggled against Kyle Danner's grip, his face red, spittle on his lips, curses strangled by the chants of hundreds. The gun glinted on the ground where it had fallen, a shard of metal under an unrelenting sun. Phones zoomed closer. The woman in denim jacket stood rooted at the steps, her voice raw from shouting, but her eyes never left Elias Marlowe. Elias descended one more step, the air pressing heavy around him. He could feel history tilting, the balance so fragile it could shatter with the smallest gesture. He spoke again, his voice calm though his pulse pounded. No one leaves unseen today. Every choice is recorded. The crowd thundered in agreement. The chant splintered into new rhythms. Justice now. Justice now. The words pounded like drums, carried on every echo, impossible to silence. Mercer broke free with a violent twist, stumbling to his knees, lunging toward the weapon. Gasps split the plaza. Hands rose instinctively, some reaching out, others clutching phones tighter. But before Mercer's fingers touched the metal, Danner's boot came down, pinning the gun against stone. His voice rang sharp. It's over, Alan. The plaza exploded in cheers. Danner bent, lifted the weapon, and tucked it into his belt, pointed down. His hands shook, but his jaw locked. For the first time, he stood not as Mercer's shadow, but as something else entirely. His eyes flicked to Elias, holding a silent acknowledgement, then back to the crowd. Mercer howled, striking out with his fists, but the other officers stepped in now, not to back him, but to restrain him. Their hands gripped his arms, their visors turned away from cameras as if ashamed. His curses cracked into incoherence. His body dragged back toward the patrol cars. The crowd roared louder, their chants rising in triumph, but the air still carried tension. The system had not broken yet. Commissioner Holloway reappeared at the courthouse entrance, flanked by aides pale with fear. His voice boomed through a megaphone, though it wavered under the roar. "Disperse now! The commission will reconvene to address complaints in due course. Please, return to your homes." The crowd laughed bitterly. The chant drowned him. "We stay. We stay." His words dissolved into the air like smoke. He turned, retreating into the shadows of marble, leaving the square to its own reckoning. Elias closed his eyes for a breath, listening. The chant, the cheers, the rhythm of hundreds fused into one relentless demand. He had carried silence for years, believing it was strength. But silence had brought them here, again and again, until humiliation bloomed into defiance. He opened his eyes to the woman in denim. She had lowered her phone, but her stare was a mirror, sharp and unforgiving. The pivot arrived quietly. Danner stepped to Elias's side. His voice was low, nearly lost in the noise, but Elias heard it. "If I speak, they'll bury me. But if you speak, they can't." His words trembled with fear and conviction both. He looked younger than ever, yet older too, as if the weight of silence had aged him. Elias's throat tightened. He looked at the young officer's face, at the sweat streaking through dust, at the trembling hands that had held back disaster. He turned then toward the crowd, the courthouse looming behind him like a cathedral of judgment. His voice rose, not shouted, but carried. "This is not about one man. It is about a system that feeds on silence." The crowd answered with thunder. The chant fractured into cheers, whistles, sobs. Some dropped their phones to raise fists instead. Others clasped hands, the square alive with recognition. Mercer's shouts faded as he was hauled into a patrol car, his face pressed against glass, his rage caged but not extinguished. The crowd saw him, named him, remembered him. His downfall was visible, undeniable, but Elias knew the system would fight to protect itself long after Mercer was gone. Danner shifted, his eyes scanning the line of officers still holding formation at the base of the steps. None advanced. Some lowered their shields entirely. For the first time, the wall of authority looked human, uncertain, exposed, seen. The woman in denim stepped closer. Her voice was steady now, cutting through the air like a blade. "Don't let them bury this inside." Her words struck not just Elias, but the crowd. A murmur spread. Inside. Inside. The chant shifted again, the demand aimed now at the courthouse doors. Holloway's pale figure hovered at the threshold, trapped. His aides whispered frantic warnings, but the crowd surged toward the steps, not violent, but unstoppable. Their voices shook the windows, their chants battering stone. Inside. Inside. Elias's heart hammered. He turned his head, glancing at Danner, at the officers wavering, at the woman whose stare pinned him to the moment. His briefcase felt impossibly heavy. Inside were the files, the testimony, the patterns written in ink and paper. Evidence not just of Mercer, but of all the buried names and untold stories. The marble steps vibrated under the press of bodies. The crowd demanded entry. The courthouse loomed, its doors half open, its shadow stretching across Elias's shoes. The system's heart lay inside, waiting, resisting, but exposed. Elias drew a slow breath, his decision suspended. His silence had protected him once. His words had ignited the crowd. Now both seemed dangerous, both necessary. The chant grew deafening. Inside, inside. Danner's voice came again, low, urgent. "They'll follow you, but only if you move first." The woman's eyes never left his. The crowd's roar swelled. The doors gaped wider, shadows spilling across stone. Elias tightened his grip on the briefcase. His foot hovered above the next step, the choice suspended in air, the city holding its breath.